I never thought I'd be the type of person to share my bed with a 70-pound bulldog. But here I am, watching Winston's chest rise and fall in perfect rhythm with the October morning light streaming through our bedroom window in suburban Denver. His wrinkled face is pressed against my pillow, one droopy ear covering half of his left eye, and his trademark underbite creating the softest snoring sound I've ever heard. My wife Sarah always jokes that Winston sleeps more peacefully than our two teenage kids ever did, and she's absolutely right. But this morning feels different. Maybe it's because today marks exactly 3 years since we brought Winston home. Or maybe it's because I've been thinking about where he came from, and where we almost never found him. I reach over and gently scratch behind his ear, feeling the familiar texture of his coat, slightly coarse but warm, and he shifts closer to me without opening his eyes. This simple gesture, this complete trust, still takes my breath away when I remember what his life was like before us. 3 years ago, I was scrolling through my phone during my lunch break at the engineering firm where I work downtown. Sarah had sent me a link to the local animal shelter's website with a message that simply read, "Just look at the dogs available. We're not getting one, just looking." I'd learned after 15 years of marriage that just looking with Sarah usually meant we were about to add something new to our family, but I clicked the link anyway. Page after page of beautiful dogs stared back at me from the screen. Golden retrievers with their perfect coats gleaming in professional photos. German shepherds standing at attention. Even a few designer mixed breeds that looked like they belonged in a magazine. I was about to close the browser when I saw him. A stocky English bulldog sitting alone in what appeared to be a concrete kennel. The photo was poorly lit, and unlike the other dogs who were photographed playing or posing, Winston was simply sitting there, looking directly at the camera with the most profound sadness in his dark eyes. The description beneath his photo was heartbreakingly honest. Winston, 3 years old, English bulldog, returned twice. Potential adopters have described him as not pretty enough and too drooling. Winston is house-trained, good with children, and desperately needs a patient family who can see past his appearance. I read those words 3 times, feeling something tighten in my chest. How could anyone look at this dog and call him ugly? Sure, his face was more wrinkled than some bulldogs, and yes, his underbite was more pronounced, giving him a perpetually surprised expression. But ugly? That word felt like a physical blow. I found myself staring at that photo for the rest of my lunch break. There was something in Winston's eyes that I couldn't shake, a resignation mixed with hope, like he was still holding on to the possibility that someone, somewhere, might see him differently. When I got home that evening, I mentioned the dog to Sarah over dinner. Our kids, Emma and Jake, were both juniors in high school, busy with college prep and part-time jobs, and our house felt quieter than it had in years. "A bulldog?" Sarah asked, setting down her fork. "Aren't they kind of high maintenance?" "Probably," I admitted, pushing my meatloaf around my plate. "But Sarah, you should see this dog's eyes. Someone actually called him ugly. Can you imagine?" She was quiet for a moment, the way she gets when she's processing something important. "What's his name?" "Winston." "Like Churchill?" "I guess so." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Winston sitting in that concrete kennel. I imagined him watching family after family walk past his cage, seeing their faces change when they really looked at him. I thought about the people who had adopted him and then brought him back, and I wondered what that must have done to his spirit. Dogs understand rejection in ways that are both simpler and more complex than humans do. They don't overthink it, but they feel it completely. Around midnight, I got up and looked at his photo again on my laptop. In the glow of the computer screen, I could see details I'd missed before. His front paws were perfectly white, like he was wearing little socks. One of his ears had a small nick in it, probably from his time on the streets before the shelter found him. And despite everything he'd been through, there was still something hopeful in his expression, something that suggested he hadn't given up entirely. I must have made some noise because Sarah appeared behind me in her robe, her hair messy from sleep. She looked at the screen over my shoulder, and I felt her hand rest gently on my back. "Oh my God," she whispered. "Look at that face." "I know. He looks so sad. The description says he's been returned twice. People said he wasn't pretty enough." Sarah was quiet for a long time, just staring at Winston's photo. Finally, she said, "What kind of person returns a dog because of how he looks?" That question hung in the air between us, and I think we both knew we'd already made our decision. The next morning was a Saturday, and before either of us could talk ourselves out of it, we were driving across town to the Rocky Mountain Animal Shelter. The October air was crisp, with that perfect Colorado clarity that makes every color more vivid. The aspens were turning golden in the foothills, and the sky was the kind of blue that only exists at high altitude. The shelter was busier than I'd expected, with families wandering through the adoption area, children pressing their faces against kennel doors, and the constant symphony of barking, whimpering, and the occasional cat's meow from the feline wing. A volunteer named Maria, probably in her 60s with kind eyes and gentle hands, approached us near the entrance. "Are you looking for anyone in particular?" she asked. "We'd like to meet Winston," Sarah said before I could answer. "The Bulldog." Maria's expression softened immediately. "Oh, Winston. He's such a sweet boy. Fair warning, though, he's not what most people expect when they think of bulldogs." She led us through a maze of kennels, past excited pit bull mixes and nervous rescue shepherds, until we reached a quieter section in the back. And there he was, exactly as he'd appeared in the photo, sitting perfectly still in his kennel, watching us approach with those same profound, intelligent eyes. "Winston," Maria called softly, and his ears perked up, but he didn't rush to the front of the kennel like most dogs would. Instead, he stood slowly, deliberately, and walked to the gate with the dignity of someone who had learned not to get too excited about potential adopters. Up close, I could see why some people might have called him ugly, though the word still made my stomach turn. His face was heavily wrinkled, more so than typical bulldogs, creating deep furrows that gave him an almost ancient, wise appearance. His underbite was pronounced enough that his bottom teeth were visible even when his mouth was closed, and yes, there was some drooling. His body was stockier than the sleek bulldogs you see in movies, with a barrel chest and thick legs that made him look like a canine bodybuilder who'd let himself go a little. But when I knelt down to his level and he looked directly into my eyes, all I could see was beauty. Not the conventional beauty of a show dog, but something deeper, a soulfulness that seemed to look right through to the heart of who I was. "Can we take him to one of the meeting rooms?" Sarah asked, and I could hear in her voice that she was already falling for him too. The meeting room was a small, cheerful space with a few chairs and some dog toys scattered on the floor. Maria brought Winston in on a leash, though he walked so calmly and close to her side that it seemed unnecessary. When she unclipped the leash, Winston didn't immediately run to us or start sniffing around the room. Instead, he sat down right where he was and looked at us expectantly, as if he was waiting for some kind of formal introduction. "He's very polite," Sarah observed, settling into one of the chairs. "Almost too polite," Maria agreed. "I think he's learned to be very careful around new people. He doesn't want to do anything that might make them change their minds." That broke my heart in a way I wasn't prepared for. I slowly approached Winston and extended my hand for him to sniff. He leaned forward, took a delicate whiff, and then, in the gentlest gesture I'd ever experienced from a dog, he rested his massive head in my palm. The weight of it, the trust it represented, made my throat tight with emotion. Sarah came over and knelt beside me, and Winston lifted his head from my hand to look at her. She reached out to stroke his ears, and he leaned into her touch with a soft sigh that seemed to release years of tension. In that moment, I understood something that I'd never really grasped before. Beauty isn't about perfection. It's about connection, about the way someone makes you feel, about the love they're capable of giving and receiving. "Maria," I said, my voice a little rougher than usual, "what do we need to do to take him home?" As we filled out the adoption paperwork, Maria told us more about Winston's story. He'd been found wandering the streets of downtown Denver as a puppy, severely underweight and with several small injuries that suggested he'd been living rough for a while. The shelter had nursed him back to health, and he'd been adopted twice, once by a family who returned him after a week because they said he didn't match their aesthetic, and once by a single man who brought him back after 3 days because Winston drooled on his leather furniture. "The thing about Winston," Maria said as she processed our application, "is that he remembers every kindness and every rejection. He's incredibly intelligent, maybe too much so for his own good. He knows when people don't really want him, and he doesn't force himself on anyone. He'll be the perfect dog for the right family, but he needs people who can see past what society tells them a beautiful dog should look like. An hour later, we were walking out of the shelter with Winston on a new leash, a bag of his food, and a folder full of his medical records and care instructions. He walked between Sarah and me, not pulling or lagging behind, but moving with a steady, dignified pace that made me think of a gentleman being escorted to an important meeting. The drive home was quiet, except for the sound of Winston's breathing from the back seat. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror to check on him, and each time I looked, he was sitting perfectly upright, looking out the window with what I could only describe as cautious optimism. When we pulled into our driveway, he remained seated until I opened the car door for him, then stepped out and surveyed our modest two-story house with the kind of careful attention you'd expect from a home inspector. Our neighborhood in Lakewood is the kind of place where kids still ride bikes in the street and neighbors know each other's names. The houses are older, built in the 1970s, with mature oak trees that create a canopy over the sidewalks. Winston seemed to approve of the quiet street and the large front yard where he could see squirrels darting between the trees. That first evening, Winston explored our house with the same methodical approach he'd used to examine our neighborhood. He sniffed every corner, investigated every room, and somehow seemed to understand immediately which areas were off-limits. When Sarah showed him his new bed in the corner of our living room, he approached it slowly, circled it 3 times, and then lay down with a deep sigh of contentment. Emma and Jake came home from their respective part-time jobs just as we were serving dinner. Emma worked at a local coffee shop and had that particular brand of teenager confidence that comes from interacting with adults all day. Jake was quieter, more thoughtful, with an artistic temperament that had him taking photographs of everything that caught his interest. "So this is the famous Winston," Emma said, dropping her backpack by the door and approaching him with the fearlessness of someone who'd grown up around animals. Winston raised his head from his bed and watched her carefully, but his tail began a slow, tentative wag when she knelt down next to him. "He's not what I expected," Jake said, but not in a negative way. He was studying Winston with the same intensity he brought to his photography. "He's got really interesting features. Look at the way the light hits those wrinkles on his forehead." And that was the moment I knew everything was going to be okay. My children, my wonderful, open-hearted children, looked at Winston and saw character instead of flaws, interesting features instead of imperfections. They saw what Sarah and I had seen, a dog worthy of love exactly as he was. That night, as we were getting ready for bed, Winston remained on his bed in the living room, even though we'd told him he was welcome to explore. Sarah and I brushed our teeth and went through our usual bedtime routine, but something felt incomplete. I found myself walking back downstairs to check on him, and there he was, still lying on his bed, eyes open, watching the stairs as if he was waiting for something. "What is it, buddy?" I asked quietly, not wanting to wake the family. Winston's tail thumped against his bed, but he didn't get up. He just continued to look at me with those expressive eyes, and I had the strangest feeling that he was asking permission for something. I sat down on the floor next to his bed, and he immediately shifted so that his head was resting on my leg. "You're home now," I told him, stroking his ears. "This is your family. You don't have to worry about being sent away again." Oh, whether he understood the words or just the tone, something in Winston relaxed. His breathing became deeper, more even, and for the first time since we'd brought him home, he truly seemed at peace. That was the beginning of everything, the start of a relationship that would change not just Winston's life, but all of ours in ways we couldn't have imagined. As I sat there on the living room floor with this remarkable dog's head in my lap, I realized that sometimes the most beautiful things in life are the ones that others overlook, the ones that don't fit conventional standards, but possess something far more valuable, the capacity to love completely, without reservation, and to teach us what real beauty actually looks like. Little did I know that this was just the first night of a journey that would challenge everything I thought I knew about family, loyalty, and the incredible power of acceptance. Winston had found his forever home, but in many ways, we had found something even more precious. A teacher who would show us that love doesn't see with the eyes, but with the heart. But our story was just beginning. And the real transformation, both Winston's and ours, was still ahead of us. The first few weeks with Winston were like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. Every day brought small revelations about his personality, his fears, and the incredible depth of his capacity for love. But it also became clear that his previous experiences had left invisible scars that ran deeper than any of us had initially understood. Winston was, without question, the most polite dog I'd ever encountered. He never begged at the dinner table, never jumped on furniture without permission, and always waited patiently by the door when he needed to go outside. But this politeness felt different from the natural good manners of a well-trained dog. It felt like the careful behavior of someone who had learned that the smallest mistake might mean abandonment. I started noticing it during his second week with us. If I raised my voice even slightly, not at him, but during a phone call or while discussing something with Sarah, Winston would immediately retreat to his bed and lie down with his head between his paws. If someone dropped something and it made a loud noise, he would freeze completely, as if he was waiting to see if this was the moment everything would go wrong again. The most heartbreaking discovery came during his third week with us. I was working from home that day, taking advantage of the quiet house to catch up on some engineering reports. Winston had been lying near my desk, content to simply be in the same room, when I knocked over my coffee mug. It wasn't a big deal, just a ceramic mug hitting the hardwood floor. But the crash sent Winston into an immediate panic. He bolted from the room so fast that I barely saw him move, and when I went looking for him, I found him wedged behind the washer and dryer in our laundry room, shaking uncontrollably. His breathing was rapid and shallow, and his eyes had that same look of resignation I'd seen in his shelter photo. It took me 20 minutes of sitting on the laundry room floor, speaking in the softest voice I could manage, before he would even look at me. "It's okay, buddy," I kept repeating. "You're safe. Nobody's going to hurt you. You're home." Eventually, he crept out of his hiding spot and pressed himself against my side, still trembling. I held him there on the cold linoleum floor of our laundry room, and I made a promise to myself and to him that we would figure out how to heal whatever wounds he was carrying. That evening, I called the shelter and spoke with Maria about Winston's reaction to loud noises. She was quiet for a long moment before she said, "I probably should have mentioned this, but Winston came to us with some behavioral issues that suggested trauma. Nothing aggressive, he would never hurt anyone, but he definitely has anxiety around sudden movements and loud sounds." The veterinary behaviorist who evaluated him thought he might have been abused before he was found on the streets. The word "abused" hit me like a physical blow. Looking at Winston's gentle, trusting face, it was impossible to imagine anyone raising a hand to him. But it explained so much about his careful behavior, his reluctance to take up space, his desperate need to please everyone around him. Sarah and I had a long conversation that night about what this meant for our family. We'd never dealt with a traumatized animal before, and we weren't sure we were equipped to handle the level of patience and understanding that Winston would need. But as we talked, sitting on our couch while Winston slept on his bed nearby, we both realized that turning him back to the shelter wasn't even a possibility. He was family now, and families don't give up on each other when things get complicated. "We'll figure it out," Sarah said, reaching over to scratch Winston's ears without waking him. "He just needs time and consistency. We can give him that." The next morning, I started researching canine anxiety and trauma recovery. I learned about desensitization techniques, the importance of routine, and how to create a safe space for a dog who had learned to expect disappointment. I also learned that Winston's behavior was actually quite common among dogs who had been abandoned multiple times. They become hypervigilant, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Armed with this new knowledge, Sarah and I began implementing small changes to help Winston feel more secure. We established a strict routine: breakfast at 7 a.m., a walk around the neighborhood at 8 a.m., quiet time while I worked from home, lunch at noon, another walk at 5 p.m., dinner at 6 p.m., and family time in the living room until bedtime. Winston thrived on this predictability, and I could see his anxiety decrease as he learned to anticipate what came next. We also started working on his confidence in small ways. Instead of feeding him from a bowl on the floor, we elevated his food and water dishes so he could eat with more dignity. We bought him a high-quality collar with his name engraved on it, a small gesture, but one that seemed to communicate permanence in a way that collar tags from previous homes never had. Most importantly, we made sure that every interaction with Winston was positive, patient, and calm. Emma and Jake, initially excited about having a dog in the house, quickly adapted to Winston's special needs. Emma, with her natural confidence, became Winston's biggest cheerleader, constantly praising him for the smallest accomplishments and celebrating every sign of progress. Jake, true to his artistic nature, began documenting Winston's journey with his camera, capturing moments that showed the gradual shift from fearful to hopeful in Winston's expressions. One evening in November, about a month after Winston had joined our family, I was reviewing some blueprints at the kitchen table when I felt a gentle pressure against my leg. Looking down, I saw Winston resting his head on my thigh, something he'd never done before. He wasn't asking for anything, wasn't seeking attention. He was simply choosing to be close to me because he wanted to be, not because he was afraid or anxious. "Hey there, buddy," I said softly, reaching down to stroke his head. His tail began a slow wag, and for the first time since we'd brought him home, I felt like he was truly relaxing with us. That was the beginning of what I started thinking of as Winston's awakening. Over the next few weeks, I began to see glimpses of the dog he might have been if his early life had been different. He started playing, tentatively at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Sarah bought him a rope toy, and after watching us play tug-of-war with it for several days, he finally joined in, his tail wagging so hard his entire back end moved with it. He also began to show us his sense of humor. Bulldogs, I learned, can be surprisingly playful and even mischievous when they feel secure. Winston developed a habit of stealing socks from the laundry basket, not to destroy them, but to carry them around the house like trophies before carefully depositing them on his bed. He would then lie down next to his collection of socks with what I could only describe as a satisfied expression, as if he was proud of his haul. But the most significant breakthrough came during Thanksgiving week. Sarah's parents were visiting from Phoenix, and I'd been worried about how Winston would handle having strangers in the house. In the past, unexpected visitors had sent him into hiding, and I didn't want him to spend the holiday stressed and anxious. My in-laws, Bob and Linda, are wonderful people, but they're not particularly dog-oriented. They've always been more focused on their grandchildren and their various hobbies than on pets. When they arrived, Winston retreated to his bed as usual, watching the new arrivals with careful attention. "So this is the famous Winston," Bob said, studying our dog with the same analytical approach he brought to everything in life. "He's certainly substantial." I bristled slightly at his tone, but before I could respond, Linda surprised all of us. She approached Winston slowly, knelt down next to his bed and said, "Hello, handsome boy. I've heard so much about you." Winston's reaction was immediate and heartwarming. His tail began to wag, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. He stood up, approached Linda carefully, and gently placed his head in her hands. The trust he showed in that moment, the willingness to be vulnerable with someone new, felt like a miracle. "Oh my," Linda said, her voice soft with emotion. "He really is beautiful, isn't he?" That Thanksgiving dinner was the first time Winston didn't retreat to his bed when we had guests. Instead, he lay on the living room rug where he could see everyone, occasionally accepting gentle pets from Linda and even allowing Bob to scratch behind his ears. When Jake spilled his cranberry sauce and the bowl clattered to the floor, Winston flinched but didn't run. Instead, he looked to me for reassurance, and when I smiled and said, "It's okay, buddy," he relaxed immediately. After dinner, as we were all sitting around talking, Winston did something he'd never done before. He approached the couch where Linda was sitting and gently rested his chin on her knee. She looked down at him with such tenderness that it brought tears to my eyes. "You know," she said to the room in general while stroking Winston's head, "I never understood why people get so attached to their pets. But looking at this sweet boy, seeing how much love he has to give and how much he clearly loves all of you, I think I'm beginning to understand." That night, after Bob and Linda had gone to bed in the guest room, I found myself reflecting on how much Winston had changed our family dynamic. Emma had become more nurturing, taking responsibility for Winston's evening walks and making sure he always had fresh water. Jake had developed a routine of reading his homework assignments out loud while Winston lay beside him, claiming that Winston was a good study buddy. Sarah had started including Winston in her daily routines, talking to him while she cooked dinner, and always making sure he had a comfortable spot near whatever room she was working in. As for me, I'd discovered that having Winston in my life had made me more patient, more observant, and more appreciative of small moments of joy. Watching him learn to trust again had taught me something profound about resilience and the power of consistent love. The real test of Winston's progress came in early December, when our neighbors, the Johnsons, were going out of town and asked if we could watch their golden retriever Max for the weekend. I was hesitant. Winston had never spent time with other dogs since joining our family, and I wasn't sure how he would handle sharing his space and his family. But Sarah thought it might be good for Winston to have some canine companionship, and after discussing it as a family, we decided to give it a try. When the Johnsons brought Max over on Friday evening, I was prepared for anxiety, territorial behavior, or at the very least some awkwardness. Instead, Winston surprised us all. He approached Max with the same careful dignity he brought to everything else, sniffed him politely, and then simply accepted his presence as if having another dog in the house was the most natural thing in the world. By Saturday morning, they were sharing Winston's water bowl, and by Saturday evening, they were lying side by side on the living room rug, each chewing on their respective toys in comfortable companionship. "Look at that," Emma said, taking a photo of the two dogs with her phone. "Winston's got a friend." Watching Winston interact with Max revealed another layer of his personality that we hadn't seen before. With the golden retriever, Winston became almost protective, making sure Max always had access to water and food, and positioning himself between Max and any potential sources of stress. When a delivery truck backfired outside our house and Max jumped nervously, Winston calmly walked over and stood next to him until the noise passed. When the Johnsons came to pick up Max on Sunday evening, Mrs. Johnson commented on how relaxed and happy Max seemed. "Whatever magic you all have worked with Winston has rubbed off on Max too," she said. "He's never been this calm during a boarding situation." After Max left, Winston seemed a little sad for the first time since joining our family. He kept checking Max's favorite spots around the house and would occasionally go to the front window as if he was watching for his friend to return. But rather than retreating into anxiety, Winston seemed to understand that this sadness was temporary, that his family was still intact, and that Max's absence didn't mean anything bad was going to happen to him. That evening, as I was getting ready for bed, I realized that Winston was following me upstairs, something he'd never done before. He'd always stayed downstairs on his bed, respecting what he seemed to perceive as family boundaries. But tonight, he climbed the stairs behind me and stopped at the doorway to our bedroom, looking at me with a question in his eyes. "What is it, buddy?" I asked. He took one step into the room, then stopped, still looking at me for permission. In that moment, I understood what he was asking, and my heart nearly burst with love for this gentle, careful soul who still sought approval for every small freedom. "Come on," I said, patting the foot of our bed. "There's plenty of room." Winston approached the bed slowly, studied it for a moment as if calculating the best way to get up without causing any disruption, and then, with surprising grace for such a stocky dog, jumped up and settled at the foot of the bed. He curled up in a tight ball, taking up as little space as possible, and looked at me with such gratitude that I had to clear my throat to keep from getting emotional. Sarah, who had been in the bathroom brushing her teeth, came out to find Winston on our bed and stopped in surprise. "Well, hello there, Winston. Making yourself comfortable?" Winston's tail wagged tentatively, and he looked between Sarah and me as if he was checking to make sure this was really okay. Sarah smiled, climbed into bed, and reached over to scratch his ears. "I guess we're a 3-person bed now," she said, settling under the covers. That night, I lay awake for a while listening to Winston's gentle snoring and thinking about the journey that had brought us all to this point. 6 months ago, Winston had been alone in a shelter kennel, rejected and unwanted. Tonight, he was sleeping peacefully between 2 people who loved him, in a house where he was not just tolerated, but cherished. The transformation hadn't been immediate or easy. It had required patience, understanding, and a willingness to see past surface appearances to the beautiful soul underneath. But as I drifted off to sleep with Winston's warm presence at the foot of our bed, I knew that every moment of effort had been worth it. Winston had learned to trust again, but more than that, He had taught us what it really means to love unconditionally. He had shown us that beauty comes in many forms, that damaged hearts can heal with the right care, and that family isn't about perfection. It's about acceptance, commitment, and the willingness to grow together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities for Winston to continue his journey from frightened survivor to beloved family member. But tonight, he was exactly where he belonged. Home, safe, and surrounded by love. What we didn't realize yet was that Winston's greatest lesson to our family was still to come, and it would arrive in a way none of us expected. By spring, Winston had become the gravitational center of our household. Every family decision seemed to revolve around him in one way or another. Weekend plans were made with Winston's walking schedule in mind. Vacation destinations were chosen based on their pet-friendly policies. Even our grocery shopping had evolved to include stops at the pet store for Winston's favorite treats, freeze-dried sweet potato chips that made him dance with excitement. But it was the small daily rituals that truly showed how deeply Winston had woven himself into the fabric of our lives. Every morning, he would make his rounds to each family member's room, offering gentle wake-up kisses to anyone who wanted them. Emma had started setting her alarm 15 minutes early just so she could have cuddle time with Winston before getting ready for school. Jake had developed a routine of taking Winston outside for a few minutes of morning photography, capturing the way the early light highlighted Winston's expressive features. Sarah and I had found that Winston's presence had actually improved our marriage in unexpected ways. Having a shared focus outside of ourselves had given us more to talk about, more reasons to laugh together, and more opportunities to work as a team. When Winston learned a new trick or displayed a particularly endearing behavior, we would spend dinner discussing it like proud parents. When he had a difficult day or seemed anxious about something, we would strategize together about how to help him feel more secure. The neighborhood had embraced Winston too, though it had taken some time. Our morning walks had become social events as other dog owners and neighbors stopped to meet the famous Bulldog they'd heard so much about. Mrs. Chen from next door, who had initially been skeptical about Winston's appearance, had become one of his biggest fans after he gently helped her find her escaped parakeet by sitting perfectly still under the tree where the bird had landed. "That dog has more sense than most people," she'd told Sarah afterward. And from that day forward, she always had a treat ready when Winston passed by her garden. But it was during Emma's senior year crisis that Winston truly proved his value to our family in ways we hadn't anticipated. Emma had always been our high achiever, student council president, honor roll student, accepted to 3 excellent colleges. But in March, the pressure of choosing between her top 2 schools had sent her into a spiral of anxiety that none of us knew how to address. She'd been accepted to both Colorado State University, where she could stay close to home and study environmental science, and to Northwestern University in Chicago, where she'd been offered a partial scholarship for journalism. The decision felt enormous to her 18-year-old mind, and she'd been losing sleep and barely eating for weeks as the deadline approached. I'll never forget the evening I found Emma crying on the living room floor, college brochures spread around her like fallen leaves, while Winston lay pressed against her side. He wasn't trying to play or seeking attention. He was simply offering his solid, warm presence as a comfort. When she wrapped her arms around his neck and buried her face in his fur, he remained perfectly still, as if he understood that this was exactly what she needed. "I don't know what to do, Winston," she whispered into his coat. "How do you choose between 2 completely different futures?" Winston, of course, couldn't answer her question, but he did something better. He shifted position so that his head was resting in her lap, and he looked up at her with those wise, patient eyes that seemed to say, "Whatever you choose will be okay. You have people who love you no matter what." Sarah and I watched this interaction from the kitchen doorway, and I felt my throat tighten with emotion. Somehow, without any training or instruction, Winston had become our family's emotional support system. He seemed to sense when each of us needed comfort, companionship, or just a reminder that we were loved unconditionally. Over the next few days, as Emma continued to struggle with her decision, Winston became her constant companion. He would lie beside her while she researched programs online, accompany her on long walks when she needed to think, and provide wordless comfort during her moments of doubt. His presence seemed to calm her in a way that our parental advice and reassurance couldn't. The breakthrough came on a Saturday morning in late March. Emma had taken Winston for an early walk, something she'd been doing more frequently when she needed to clear her head. They'd been gone for about an hour when my phone rang. Emma's voice was excited but calm, the first time she'd sounded truly peaceful in weeks. "Dad, I need you and Mom to meet me at Sloan's Lake. Bring Winston's favorite treats. Is everything okay?" "Everything's perfect. I know what I'm going to do." Sarah and I drove to the lake with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Sloan's Lake was a popular spot for dog walking, with a beautiful path that circled the entire lake and offered stunning views of the Rocky Mountains. When we arrived, we found Emma and Winston sitting on a bench overlooking the water, both of them looking more relaxed than I'd seen either of them in weeks. "I'm going to Northwestern," Emma announced as we approached. "I figured it out while Winston and I were walking. Actually, I think Winston figured it out for me." She explained that during their walk, she'd been talking through her decision out loud, using Winston as a sounding board the way many people use a therapist or counselor. As she spoke about each option, she'd watched Winston's reactions, not because she thought he could actually understand the complexities of college choice, but because his calm, non-judgmental presence allowed her to hear her own thoughts more clearly. "When I talked about staying at CSU, I felt safe but also kind of disappointed," she said, scratching behind Winston's ears. "When I talked about Northwestern, I felt scared but also excited. And I realized that Winston has taught me something important about fear and courage. He was terrified when he first came to us, but he didn't let that fear stop him from learning to trust us and love us. He took the risk of opening his heart again, even though he'd been hurt before." Sarah and I looked at each other, amazed by our daughter's insight and the role that Winston had played in helping her find it. "I want to take that kind of risk too," Emma continued. "I want to be brave enough to try something that scares me, because I know that no matter what happens, I have a family that loves me unconditionally. Winston has shown me what that kind of love looks like, and I want to carry that with me wherever I go." That afternoon, we celebrated Emma's decision with a family barbecue in our backyard. Winston, perhaps sensing the festive mood, was more playful than usual, bringing us sticks to throw and performing his favorite trick, sitting up on his hind legs and begging with his front paws in the air, his tongue hanging out in concentration. Jake captured the perfect photo that day, Emma hugging Winston while all of us laughed at something he'd done, the golden afternoon light making everyone look warm and happy. Later, when Jake developed the film in his school's darkroom, he gave Emma a copy to take with her to college. "So you don't forget what unconditional love looks like," he said, and I watched Emma's eyes fill with tears as she hugged her little brother. As spring turned to summer, Winston continued to surprise us with his emotional intelligence and his ability to sense what each family member needed. When Jake was struggling with a photography project for his AP art class, Winston seemed to understand that he needed a willing subject. Jake spent hours photographing Winston in different lights and settings, eventually creating a series he called Beauty Redefined that earned him a spot in the state high school art competition. The photos were stunning, black and white portraits that captured every wrinkle, every imperfection in Winston's face, but also the warmth in his eyes, the gentleness in his expression, and the dignity in his bearing. The series challenged viewers to look beyond conventional beauty standards and see the character and soul that made Winston truly beautiful. When the local newspaper did a feature story about Jake's award-winning photography series, they included an interview with our family about Winston's impact on our lives. The reporter, a young woman named Lisa, who initially seemed skeptical about the fuss over just a dog, left our house with tears in her eyes and a completely different perspective. "I've never met a dog who seemed so wise," she said as she was packing up her equipment. "He really does have something special about him." The article, titled "The Bulldog Who Changed Everything," featured several of Jake's photographs alongside quotes from our family about how Winston had taught us about acceptance, resilience, and the true meaning of beauty. The response was overwhelming. We received letters and emails from people all over Colorado who had been touched by Winston's story and inspired to look more carefully at the animals in their own local shelters. But the most meaningful response came from Maria at the Rocky Mountain Animal Shelter. She called us a few days after the article was published to tell us that 3 bulldogs and several other, less conventionally attractive dogs had been adopted that week, with potential families specifically mentioning Winston's story as their inspiration. "Winston is changing lives even beyond your family," Maria said. "He's become an ambassador for all the dogs who get overlooked because they don't fit someone's idea of what a perfect pet should look like." That summer was one of the best our family had ever experienced, with Emma preparing to leave for college in the fall but still present for those precious final months. We made the most of our time together. Winston was included in every activity, from camping trips in the Rocky Mountains to lazy afternoons by the community pool, where he was content to lie in the shade and watch us swim. We discovered that Winston was an excellent travel companion. He rode patiently in the car for hours, never complaining or getting carsick. He adapted quickly to new environments, as long as his family was with him. And he had a remarkable ability to charm strangers wherever we went, something that had particular impact given his unconventional appearance. During a camping trip to Rocky Mountain National Park, Winston won over a family from Texas who had initially seemed skeptical about sharing a campground with such an ugly dog. By the end of the weekend, their 10-year-old daughter was begging her parents to get a bulldog just like Winston, and the father was helping Jake take photos of Winston with the mountain peaks in the background. "You know," the father said to me as we were packing up our camp, "I always thought bulldogs were kind of gross looking. But there's something about Winston that just makes you forget all that. He's got more personality than most people I know." As August approached and Emma's departure date drew near, I noticed that Winston seemed to sense something was changing. He began following Emma more closely, as if he didn't want to miss any time with her. She responded by including him in all her college preparation activities, letting him help her pack by lying on her clothes and providing commentary on her choices. "What do you think, Winston?" she'd ask, holding up different outfits. "Is this too formal for orientation? Should I bring more sweaters?" Winston would tilt his head attentively, as if he was actually considering her questions, and Emma would laugh and scratch his ears before making her decision. The night before Emma left for Northwestern, she insisted that Winston sleep in her room one last time. Sarah and I found them the next morning cuddled together on her bed, Emma's arms wrapped around Winston's bulk, both of them looking peaceful but somehow sad. The goodbye scene at the airport was emotional for everyone, but watching Emma hug Winston was particularly heartbreaking. She knelt down to his level and spoke to him quietly for several minutes, her words lost in his fur, but her tears visible to all of us. "Take care of Mom and Dad and Jake for me," she whispered loudly enough for us to hear. "And remember, you're the most beautiful dog in the world, no matter what anyone else says." Winston seemed to understand the significance of the moment. He didn't try to follow Emma toward the security checkpoint, but he sat perfectly still and watched until she disappeared from view. Then he looked up at me with those expressive eyes, and I swear I could see a question there. "Will she come back?" "She'll come back," I told him, and I hoped I was right. The house felt different after Emma left. Quieter, somehow smaller, despite the fact that we still had the same number of people and one very substantial dog. Winston seemed to feel the change too. For the first few days, he would check Emma's room every morning as if he expected to find her there. When he realized she was truly gone, he didn't retreat into anxiety the way he might have in his early days with us. Instead, he seemed to understand that this was a different kind of absence, temporary, purposeful, and not a rejection. Jake stepped up to fill some of the void Emma had left, taking over her morning walk duties and spending more time with Winston in the evenings. Sarah and I found ourselves appreciating Winston's presence even more acutely. He provided continuity and comfort during this transition, a steady reminder that families can change and evolve while still maintaining their essential bonds. 3 weeks after Emma left for college, we received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed copy of one of Jake's photographs of Winston, the one where he's sitting in our backyard with the late afternoon sun highlighting his wrinkled face, his expression serene and dignified. Emma had written on the back, "To the most beautiful soul I know, thank you for teaching me about love, courage, and the importance of looking beyond the surface. I miss you every day. Love, Emma." That photo now sits on Emma's dresser in her empty room, and Winston still checks on it every morning during his rounds. But he no longer seems sad about her absence. Instead, he seems proud, as if he understands that he played a role in helping her find the courage to pursue her dreams. As we settled into our new routine as a family of 4, I reflected on how profoundly Winston had changed our lives. He had arrived as the dog nobody wanted, the one considered too ugly for most families. But he had become the heart of our home, the center around which all our best qualities revolved. He had taught Emma about courage, inspired Jake's artistic vision, brought Sarah and me closer together, and shown all of us that real beauty comes from love, loyalty, and the willingness to open your heart completely. Winston's journey from reject to beloved family member was complete, but our journey with him was far from over. Every day brought new opportunities to learn from his example, to see the world through his compassionate eyes, and to remember that the most valuable gifts often come in unexpected packages. But as autumn arrived and our family continued to evolve, Winston would face his greatest challenge yet, one that would test everything we'd learned about love, loyalty, and the true meaning of family. October in Colorado is magical. The aspen trees turn brilliant gold, the air becomes crisp and clean, and there's a sense of anticipation in the atmosphere as winter approaches. Winston had always loved this season, perhaps because it reminded him of his first days with our family. He would spend hours in our backyard, lying under the oak tree and watching the leaves fall, occasionally pouncing on one that drifted close enough to be interesting. This particular October felt especially significant because Emma was coming home for her first college break. She'd been gone for 2 months, and while we'd talked regularly on video calls, always including Winston, who would perk up at the sound of her voice, nothing could replace having her physically present. Jake had been counting down the days on his calendar, and Sarah had planned an elaborate welcome home dinner featuring all of Emma's favorite foods. Winston seemed to sense something special was approaching. In the days leading up to Emma's return, he was more alert than usual, spending long periods sitting by the front window as if he was watching for her arrival. Dogs have an incredible ability to perceive changes in their family's energy and routine, and Winston was no exception. The morning Emma was supposed to arrive, Winston was practically vibrating with excitement. He followed me through my morning routine with more intensity than usual, and when I sat down with my coffee to wait for her flight information, he positioned himself directly between me and the front door, clearly not wanting to miss her entrance. "She'll be here soon, buddy," I told him, scratching behind his ears. His tail wagged, but his eyes never left the door. When Emma's taxi finally pulled into our driveway, Winston began a low, happy whine that I'd never heard from him before. The moment the front door opened and Emma stepped inside with her luggage, Winston's entire body seemed to explode with joy. He rushed to her with more enthusiasm than I'd ever seen him display, his whole back end wiggling with excitement, his tail moving so fast it was practically a blur. "Winston!" Emma cried, dropping her bags and kneeling to receive his greeting. He covered her face with kisses, pressing his entire body against her as if he wanted to make sure she was really there. For several minutes, they just held each other on our entryway floor, both of them making soft sounds of happiness and recognition. "I missed you so much," Emma whispered into his fur. "You got even more handsome while I was gone." That weekend was filled with the kind of perfect family moments that you want to preserve forever. Emma caught us up on her college experiences, sharing stories about her classes, her roommate, and the independence she was learning to navigate. Jake showed her his latest photography projects, including several more portraits of Winston that he'd been experimenting with. Sarah fussed over Emma's eating habits and general well-being with the dedicated attention of a mother who'd missed having someone to take care of. And Winston? Winston was in absolute heaven. He followed Emma everywhere, as if he was afraid she might disappear again if he looked away. When she studied at the kitchen table, he lay at her feet. When she watched TV in the living room, he pressed himself against her side on the couch. When she went upstairs to unpack, he stayed at the bottom of the stairs, waiting patiently for her to come back down. "He's like your shadow," Jake observed, taking photos of Emma and Winston together. "It's like he's making up for lost time." Sunday evening came too quickly, and as Emma prepared to return to Chicago, the whole family felt the weight of another goodbye approaching. But this time, there was something different about Winston's behavior. While he stayed close to Emma, he didn't seem as anxious as I'd expected. It was as if the joy of her visit had reassured him that absences were temporary, that love endured across distance and time. The goodbye at the airport was easier for everyone, including Winston. He sat calmly as Emma hugged each of us, and when she knelt down to say goodbye to him, he licked her face gently and then stepped back, as if he understood that this was how things were now, visits and departures, but always with the promise of return. "Take care of everyone," Emma told him, just as she had before. "I'll see you at Thanksgiving." Life settled back into its new normal after Emma's visit, but something had shifted in all of us. The visit had proved that our family bonds could stretch across distance without breaking, and that Winston was a crucial part of maintaining those connections. He had become our emotional anchor, the constant that made all the changes and transitions feel manageable. November brought early snow and the excitement of planning for Thanksgiving. Emma would be home for a full week, and Sarah's parents were coming again, along with my brother David and his family from California. It would be the largest gathering we'd hosted in years, and Sarah was in full preparation mode, planning menus and organizing sleeping arrangements with military precision. Winston seemed to enjoy all the activity and preparation. He had learned to stay out of the kitchen when Sarah was cooking, but he positioned himself where he could observe everything, his eyes following her movements with interest and occasional hope that something might fall within his reach. 3 days before Emma was supposed to arrive for Thanksgiving, I noticed that Winston seemed a little less energetic than usual. He'd eaten his breakfast, but without his typical enthusiasm, and when I offered to take him for his morning walk, he seemed reluctant to leave the house. I chalked it up to the cold weather. November in Denver can be brutal, and Winston had never been a fan of freezing temperatures. But by that evening, it was clear that something was wrong. Winston, who normally claimed his spot on our bed each night, remained downstairs on his living room bed. When I went to check on him, I found him lying very still, his breathing shallow and rapid. "Hey, buddy," I said softly, kneeling beside his bed. "How are you feeling?" He lifted his head to look at me, and I could see something in his eyes that I'd never seen before, a kind of quiet distress that made my stomach tighten with worry. When I placed my hand on his side, I could feel his heart racing, much faster than normal. "Sarah," I called, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can you come here for a minute?" Sarah took one look at Winston and immediately knew something was seriously wrong. "We need to get him to the vet," she said, already reaching for her car keys. The emergency veterinary clinic was a 45-minute drive across town, and Winston rode in the back seat with his head in my lap, breathing heavily but remaining calm. I found myself stroking his ears and talking to him the entire way, telling him that everything would be okay, that we were going to take care of him, that he was going to be fine. But even as I said the words, I felt a cold fear growing in my chest. Dr. Martinez, the emergency vet, was a kind woman in her 50s who immediately put us at ease with her gentle manner and obvious competence. She examined Winston thoroughly while we waited in a small room that smelled of antiseptic and fear, the familiar combination of any medical facility. When she returned with Winston after running several tests, her expression was serious, but not hopeless. "Winston has what appears to be a heart arrhythmia," she explained, showing us the results of his EKG. "It's not uncommon in bulldogs, especially as they get older, but it does require immediate treatment and ongoing management." She explained that Winston would need to stay overnight for monitoring and medication adjustment, and that we would need to work with a veterinary cardiologist to develop a long-term treatment plan. The good news was that with proper medication, many dogs with heart conditions could live comfortable, happy lives for years. The challenging news was that Winston's life would never be quite the same. He would need daily medication, regular monitoring, and careful attention to his activity levels and stress. Leaving Winston at the clinic that night was one of the hardest things I'd ever done. He looked at me with such trust and confusion as the veterinary technician led him away to the monitoring area, and I had to force myself not to change my mind and demand to take him home immediately. Sarah and I drove home in near silence, both of us processing this new reality. Winston, our steady, reliable emotional anchor, was vulnerable in a way we'd never considered. The dog who had seemed so solid, so permanent, was facing a serious health challenge that could change everything. We called Jake as soon as we got home, and then called Emma at her dorm. Both conversations were difficult. How do you tell your children that the family dog they adore is sick without causing panic or despair? We tried to strike a balance between honesty and reassurance, explaining the situation but emphasizing that this was manageable, that Winston would be coming home, that we would all work together to take care of him. Emma's response was immediate and characteristic. "I'm coming home," she said. "I'll drive instead of flying so I can get there faster." "Emma, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. Winston was there for me when I needed him. Now I need to be there for him." That night, Sarah and I lay in our bed, which felt enormous and wrong without Winston's warm presence at the foot, and talked about what this meant for our family. We'd always known, intellectually, that pets have shorter lifespans than humans, that loving an animal means accepting the inevitability of loss. But knowing something intellectually and facing it emotionally are completely different experiences. "He's not dying," Sarah said into the darkness. "The vet said this is manageable." "I know, but everything's going to be different now. He'll need special care, medication, monitoring. What if he can't enjoy the things he loves? What if he becomes anxious or uncomfortable? Then we'll figure it out, just like we figured out how to help him trust us when he first came home, just like we figured out everything else with him." The next morning, Dr. Martinez called early to update us on Winston's progress. The medication was helping stabilize his heart rhythm, and he'd eaten breakfast and seemed comfortable. We could pick him up that afternoon, along with detailed instructions for his ongoing care. When we arrived at the clinic, Winston greeted us with his typical dignity, but also with obvious relief. His tail wagged steadily as we signed paperwork and listened to discharge instructions, and he stayed close to my side, as if he didn't want to risk another separation. The ride home was different from the panicked trip to the clinic. Winston seemed more himself, interested in looking out the windows and occasionally turning to lick Sarah's hand when she reached back to pet him. But I noticed that he was still breathing more heavily than normal, and I found myself watching him more carefully than I ever had before. Emma arrived that evening, having driven straight through from Chicago. Her first stop was the living room floor where Winston was resting, and their reunion was gentle but profound. Instead of the exuberant greeting of a few weeks earlier, this was quieter, more tender. Emma lay down beside Winston's bed and simply held him, both of them seeming to understand that something fundamental had changed. "How is he really?" she asked me later, when we had a moment alone. "Scared," I admitted. "Not of the heart condition specifically, but of what it means. He's always been our rock, you know, the stable one. Now he's the one who needs taking care of." Over the next few days, as we adjusted to Winston's new medication schedule and learned to read the subtle signs of his condition, something beautiful began to happen. Instead of becoming more fragile or anxious, Winston seemed to settle into a new kind of grace. He was calmer, more present, as if his health scare had reminded him to appreciate each moment rather than taking them for granted. The medications made him a little sleepier than usual, but they also seemed to ease some anxiety he'd been carrying that we hadn't even noticed. He was more affectionate, more willing to ask for attention, more comfortable taking up space in our family. Jake captured this transformation in a series of new photographs. Winston sleeping peacefully in a patch of afternoon sunlight, Winston being gently brushed by Emma, Winston simply existing in our space with a contentment that was almost meditative. These photos were different from Jake's earlier work. They showed not just Winston's character, but his wisdom, his acceptance of change, his ability to find peace in the midst of uncertainty. "He's teaching us something new," Jake observed as he showed us the latest photos, "about how to handle being vulnerable, about how to accept help gracefully." Emma's extended Thanksgiving visit became a masterclass in family caregiving. She took charge of Winston's morning medication, turning it into a special ritual that included his favorite treats and lots of praise. She researched heart-healthy activities for dogs and developed a modified exercise routine that kept Winston active without overexerting him. Most importantly, she demonstrated the kind of calm, confident care that reassured Winston that he was still valued and loved, regardless of his limitations. "You know what I realized?" Emma said on her last night home, as we all sat in the living room with Winston stretched out across multiple laps. Winston isn't weak now that he has a heart condition. He's just different. And different doesn't mean less valuable or less loved. As I listened to my daughter, my wise, compassionate daughter who had learned so much about love and acceptance from this remarkable dog, I realized that Winston was still teaching us, still transforming our family in profound ways. His health crisis hadn't diminished him. It had revealed new depths of his character and new dimensions of our love for him. The heart condition would be part of Winston's story from now on, but it wouldn't define him any more than his early rejection and trauma had defined him. He was still Winston, gentle, dignified, loving, and wise. He was still the heart of our family, still our teacher and our comfort and our daily reminder that love comes in many forms. That night, as Winston settled onto our bed with his slightly more labored breathing and his new collection of medications, I realized that this chapter of his life wasn't about loss or limitation. It was about adaptation, resilience, and the deepening of bonds that had already proven unbreakable. We would face whatever came next together, as a family, with the same love and commitment that had brought us this far. Winston had taught us about accepting differences, about seeing beauty in unexpected places, and about the transformative power of unconditional love. Now he was teaching us about aging gracefully, about finding strength in vulnerability, and about the preciousness of each ordinary day. As winter settled over Colorado and our family adapted to our new reality, none of us could have predicted the profound lesson Winston was about to teach us about the true meaning of heroism. Winter in Denver that year was particularly harsh, with sub-zero temperatures and snowstorms that seemed to arrive weekly. Winston, with his heart condition and new limitations, became even more of a homebody, content to spend long hours by our fireplace, watching the snow fall through the living room windows. We'd established a careful routine around his medication schedule and modified exercise needs, and he seemed to thrive within these new boundaries. The daily heart medication had to be given precisely at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m., and Winston had learned to anticipate these moments with the same precision as an atomic clock. He would position himself by his food bowl 5 minutes before each dose, sitting with perfect posture and looking expectantly at whoever was responsible for that day's medication duty. Emma had turned it into such a positive experience during her Thanksgiving visit that Winston actually seemed to look forward to these moments as special bonding time. Dr. Chen, the veterinary cardiologist we'd been referred to, was amazed by Winston's adaptation to his new routine. During our monthly checkups, she would comment on how stable his condition was, how well he was responding to treatment, and how his quality of life seemed uncompromised by his diagnosis. Some dogs become anxious or depressed when they develop chronic conditions, she explained during one visit in January. But Winston seems to have accepted his new normal with remarkable grace. It's probably because he feels so secure in his family environment. What Dr. Chen said was true. Winston did seem remarkably at peace with his limitations. He no longer attempted to chase squirrels with his former enthusiasm, but he still enjoyed watching them from his favorite spot under the oak tree. He couldn't go on the long hikes we used to take in the foothills, but he seemed perfectly content with shorter neighborhood walks that allowed him to visit with his canine friends and human admirers. If anything, Winston's heart condition had made him even more popular in our neighborhood. Word had spread about his diagnosis, and neighbors who had always been friendly became genuinely caring, asking about his progress and adjusting their own routines to accommodate his needs. Mrs. Chen started timing her garden work to coincide with Winston's morning walks so she could give him his daily treat. The Johnsons began including Winston in their weekend barbecues, making sure there was always a shady spot where he could rest comfortably while still being part of the social gathering. Jake's photography project about Winston had evolved too, becoming a year-long documentation of life with a special needs pet. He was planning to submit it as his senior portfolio for college applications with the working title, Resilience, A Portrait of Adaptation. The photos from this period showed Winston in a new light, not as a dog limited by illness, but as a being who had learned to find joy and purpose within new parameters. Emma's weekly video calls from Northwestern had become family events, with all of us gathering around the laptop so she could see Winston and check on his progress. She'd become remarkably knowledgeable about canine cardiology, researching new treatments and dietary recommendations with the dedication of a veterinary student. Her psychology professor had even allowed her to write a paper about the psychological benefits of human-animal bonding, using Winston as her primary case study. "I never thought I'd be writing academic papers about my dog," she laughed during one call, "but Winston keeps teaching me things that apply to everything I'm studying." February brought an unexpected test of Winston's new stability when Sarah's father, Bob, had a minor heart attack and needed to stay with us for several weeks while he recovered. Bob had always been a robust, independent man, and being suddenly dependent on others for daily activities was a difficult adjustment for him. He was frustrated, anxious, and not particularly good at following his own medical restrictions. Winston seemed to recognize a kindred spirit in Bob's situation. Without any prompting from us, he began spending most of his day near Bob's temporary bedroom on the main floor, offering quiet companionship during Bob's recovery period. When Bob grew restless or frustrated with his limitations, Winston would appear beside his chair, resting his head on Bob's knee with such perfect timing that we began to suspect he could sense changes in Bob's mood or blood pressure. "That dog is better medicine than anything the doctors gave me," Bob told Sarah one afternoon, absently stroking Winston's ears while they both watched the snow fall outside. "He doesn't judge me for being weak or different now. He just accepts it." The parallel between Bob and Winston wasn't lost on any of us. Both were learning to navigate life with heart conditions. Both had to accept new limitations, and both were discovering that their value to the family wasn't diminished by their need for special care. Watching them together, two proud individuals who had learned to find dignity in vulnerability, was profoundly moving. Winston's influence on Bob's recovery was remarkable. Bob began following his medication schedule more diligently after watching Winston's enthusiastic compliance with his own pills. He started taking the short, gentle walks that his cardiologist recommended, often with Winston as his companion. Most importantly, he seemed to find peace with his new limitations by observing how gracefully Winston had adapted to similar challenges. "You know," Bob said to me one evening as we watched Winston and him doing their synchronized evening medication routine, "I always thought that getting old and sick meant becoming useless. But watching Winston, seeing how much joy he still brings to everyone, how much love he still has to give, I'm starting to think maybe I was wrong about what makes a life valuable." When Bob was finally cleared to return to his own home in Phoenix, his goodbye with Winston was surprisingly emotional. Bob, who had never been particularly demonstrative with affection, knelt down stiffly beside Winston's bed and spoke to him quietly for several minutes. "Thank you for showing me how to do this with dignity," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Take care of yourself, old friend." Winston's tail thumped gently against his bed, and he reached up to lick Bob's hand, a gesture of such pure kindness that it brought tears to all our eyes. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came a sense of renewal and optimism. Winston's condition remained stable. Bob was doing well in Phoenix, and Emma was thriving at Northwestern. Jake was finishing his senior year with the confidence of someone who had found his artistic voice, and Sarah and I were looking forward to the prospect of becoming empty nesters who weren't quite empty. We still had Winston after all. It was during this period of relative calm that Winston reminded us of something we'd almost forgotten in the midst of managing his health condition. He was still a dog with all the instincts and protective impulses that entailed. The incident happened on a Tuesday evening in early May. Sarah was working late at her accounting firm, finishing up with tax season clients. Jake was at baseball practice, and I was in my home office, reviewing some blueprints for a commercial project. Winston was in his usual evening spot, lying in the living room where he could keep an eye on both the front and back doors. I was deep in concentration when I heard Winston make a sound I'd never heard from him before, a low, continuous growl that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. Looking up from my work, I saw him standing at the front window, every muscle in his body tense, his hackles raised in a way that made him look twice his normal size. "What is it, buddy?" I asked, getting up to investigate. When I reached the window, I could see what had alarmed Winston. A man was standing in our neighbor's yard next door, not the Johnson's house, but the rental property on the other side that had been empty for several months. The man was wearing dark clothing and was clearly trying to stay hidden behind the large pine tree that separated our properties. He was watching our house with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I called 911 immediately, speaking quietly into the phone while keeping an eye on both the stranger and Winston. Our local police were familiar with our neighborhood, a generally safe area where the most serious crime was usually teenagers parking where they shouldn't, and they took the call seriously. While we waited for the police to arrive, Winston maintained his vigil at the window. He didn't bark or make any noise that might alert the intruder to our awareness, but his body language made it clear that he was prepared to defend his home and family if necessary. This was a side of Winston I'd never seen before. Not the gentle, patient therapy dog who had comforted Bob during his recovery, but a protective guardian who took his family's safety seriously. When the police cruiser pulled up, the man immediately fled through the backyards of the neighboring houses. The officers took a report and increased patrols in our area for the next several weeks. But we never found out who the man was or what his intentions might have been. What struck me most about the incident wasn't the fear or the mystery, but Winston's behavior throughout the entire episode. Despite his heart condition, despite his generally calm demeanor, despite his advanced age, Winston had been prepared to protect his family without hesitation. His condition hadn't made him weak or passive. It had simply changed the parameters within which his strength operated. "Good boy," I told him after the police left, sitting beside him on the living room floor. "You took care of us." Winston's tail wagged, and he leaned against me with the satisfied air of someone who had done his job well. In that moment, I realized that his heart condition hadn't changed who he fundamentally was. It had simply revealed new aspects of his character that we might never have seen otherwise. When Sarah came home and I told her about the incident, her first concern was whether the stress had affected Winston's heart. But checking with Dr. Chen the next day, we learned that Winston's vital signs showed no negative impact from the evening's excitement. If anything, having a clear purpose and the ability to protect his family seemed to have energized him. Some dogs with heart conditions actually do better when they have a sense of purpose, Dr. Chen explained. Winston clearly feels responsible for your family's safety, and that responsibility gives him strength rather than stress. The attempted break-in became a neighborhood legend, with Winston cast as the unlikely hero who had saved the day through his vigilance and protective instincts. But for our family, it was something deeper, proof that love and loyalty transcend physical limitations, that the heart that matters most isn't necessarily the one that beats perfectly. Jake captured the perfect photo to commemorate the incident. Winston sitting at the front window in profile, alert and dignified, with the late afternoon light highlighting the noble lines of his face. It became the centerpiece of Jake's senior portfolio, titled simply Guardian. When Emma came home for summer break a few weeks later, she listened to the story of Winston's heroic evening with pride and amazement. "He's like a superhero," she said, kneeling beside Winston's bed to give him a congratulatory hug. A superhero with a heart condition who saves the day through wisdom and vigilance instead of physical strength. That summer was one of the most peaceful and happy periods our family had ever experienced. Emma was home but more independent. Jake was preparing for his senior year with confidence and purpose. Sarah and I were enjoying the balance of having adult children who still wanted to spend time with us, and Winston was thriving within his new normal. We adjusted our summer activities to accommodate Winston's needs, but we didn't feel limited by them. We still went camping, but we chose locations at lower altitudes with easier hiking trails. We still had backyard barbecues, but we made sure Winston had plenty of shade and fresh water. We still took family photos and made family memories, but we were more intentional about capturing the quiet moments, the everyday kindnesses, the simple joys that Winston had taught us to notice. One evening in late July, as we all sat on our back deck watching the sunset paint the Rocky Mountains in shades of gold and pink, Emma made an observation that has stayed with me ever since. "You know what I love most about Winston?" she said, absent-mindedly stroking his ears as he rested his head in her lap. "He's never tried to be anything other than who he is. When people called him ugly, he didn't try to change his appearance. When he was scared and traumatized, he didn't pretend to be confident. When he developed a heart condition, he didn't fight against his limitations. He just adapted. He found ways to be himself within whatever circumstances he faced. Jake looked up from the photos he was editing on his laptop. That's kind of revolutionary, isn't it? In a world where everyone's trying to be perfect or different or better than they are, Winston just commits to being authentically himself. Sarah and I exchanged a look over Winston's sleeping form. Our children had learned something from this remarkable dog that many adults never master: the courage to be vulnerable, the wisdom to accept limitations, and the power that comes from loving unconditionally. As summer faded into early autumn and Jake began his senior year, I found myself thinking often about the gifts Winston had brought to our family. He had taught us about beauty, courage, resilience, and acceptance. He had shown us that strength comes in many forms, that love transcends physical limitations, and that family is defined not by perfection, but by commitment. But perhaps his greatest gift was still to come, a lesson about grace and dignity that would transform our understanding of what it means to live fully, love completely, and face the future with courage. As autumn returned to Colorado and our family prepared for another year of changes and challenges, Winston was about to give us the most profound lesson of all, one that would stay with us forever. By the time Jake's senior year began, Winston had been part of our family for 4 years. 4 years that had transformed not just his life, but all of ours in ways we were still discovering. He was now 7 years old, which put him solidly in middle age for a bulldog, especially one with a heart condition. But he carried his years with such dignity and grace that it was easy to forget he wasn't the young dog who had first captured our hearts at the shelter. The autumn routine had become a comfortable dance between all of us. Jake would take Winston for a short morning walk before school, capturing photos when the light was particularly beautiful. I would handle the morning medication with Winston's breakfast, a ritual that had evolved into a few minutes of quiet bonding before my workday began. Sarah would check on Winston throughout the day when she worked from home, and she'd taken to bringing her laptop to the living room so Winston could nap nearby while she managed her clients' accounts. Emma's junior year at Northwestern was going well, and she decided to spend fall break at home rather than traveling with friends. "I want to be with my family," she said during one of our weekly video calls. "Especially Winston. I feel like I'm missing so much of his day-to-day life." What she was missing, though it would be hard to explain to someone who hadn't lived with Winston, was the subtle evolution of his personality as he aged. He'd become even more intuitive about our emotional needs, if that was possible. When Sarah was stressed about a particularly difficult client, Winston would appear beside her desk and rest his head on her leg until she took a break. When Jake was frustrated with college applications or worried about his photography portfolio, Winston would seek him out and simply lie nearby, offering comfort through his presence. He'd also developed some endearing quirks that felt like signs of his growing comfort with our family. He'd begun collecting items from around the house, not destructively, but purposefully. A sock from the laundry basket, one of Jake's old baseball caps, a throw pillow from the couch. He would carefully carry these treasures to his bed and arrange them around himself like a nest, as if he was creating a physical representation of his connection to each family member. "He's made himself a shrine to our family," Sarah observed one morning, looking at Winston's bed surrounded by his collection of our belongings. "It's like he's claiming us as officially as we've claimed him." Dr. Chen continued to be pleased with Winston's stability during our monthly checkups. His heart rhythm remained irregular, but manageable. His medication was keeping his symptoms controlled, and his overall quality of life seemed excellent. She'd started using Winston as an example for other pet owners dealing with similar diagnoses, explaining how a stable home environment and consistent care could help dogs thrive despite chronic conditions. "Winston is one of my success stories," she told us during his September appointment. "He proves that a heart condition doesn't have to mean a diminished life. He's living fully within his limitations, and that's exactly what we want to see." But I was beginning to notice subtle changes that the medical tests might not detect. Winston slept a little more than he used to, and his sleep was deeper, less easily disturbed by household noises. He was still enthusiastic about his walks, but he chose his pace more carefully, stopping to rest when he needed to, rather than pushing through fatigue. Most significantly, he seemed to be savoring experiences more intentionally, as if he understood that each day was precious. This became particularly evident during Emma's fall break visit in October. Winston greeted her with his usual joy, but there was something different about his attention to her during this visit. He followed her even more closely than usual, and when she was sitting still, he would position himself so that he was touching her, his head on her feet, his side pressed against her leg, his paw resting on her arm. "He's being extra clingy," Emma observed after a few days. "Not anxious clingy, but I don't know how to describe it, like he's memorizing me." Jake, ever the artist, noticed it too. "It's like he's more present than usual, more focused on each moment." I didn't want to worry the kids, but I was having similar observations. Winston seemed to be paying attention to everything with heightened awareness. The way the morning light fell across the kitchen floor, the sound of our voices during dinner conversation, the feeling of being brushed or petted. It was as if he was consciously appreciating experiences that he'd previously taken for granted. When I mentioned this to Dr. Chen during Winston's October appointment, she nodded thoughtfully. Dogs often become more present as they age, especially when they have health conditions that make them more aware of their mortality. It's not necessarily a sign that anything is wrong. It might just be Winston's way of living more mindfully. Her words were comforting, but they also introduced a concept I wasn't ready to fully consider: Winston's mortality. Intellectually, I'd always known that dogs have shorter lifespans than humans. But emotionally, Winston had become such a constant in our lives that it was hard to imagine a future without him. That evening, I found myself sitting on the living room floor beside Winston's bed, watching him sleep. His breathing was slightly labored. It had been for months, but it was steady and peaceful. Occasionally, his legs would move, as if he was running in his dreams, and I wondered what he dreamed about. Did he dream about his puppyhood on the streets? His early days in the shelter? Or did he dream about our family, about the security and love he'd found with us? "Dad?" Jake's voice made me look up. He was standing at the foot of the stairs, camera in hand as always. "Are you okay?" "Just thinking," I said, "about Winston, about how much he's changed our lives." Jake sat down on the floor beside me, setting his camera aside. "He's okay, isn't he? I mean, his heart condition is stable. Dr. Chen says he's doing great. I think I'm just realizing how much I take him for granted, how much I assume he'll always be here." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, both of us watching Winston sleep. Finally, Jake said, "I've been thinking about that too. It's why I've been taking so many photos of him lately. I want to make sure we remember everything about him exactly as he is right now." That conversation stayed with me over the next few weeks. Jake's comment about remembering Winston exactly as he is right now made me more conscious of the daily details I might otherwise overlook. The way Winston stretched when he woke up, extending each leg deliberately before rising. The sound of his collar tags jingling as he walked. The precise spot on the couch where he preferred to nap in the afternoon sunlight. Sarah noticed my increased attention to Winston's daily routines. "You're studying him," she said one morning as I watched Winston navigate his breakfast ritual. "Like you're trying to memorize him." "Maybe I am," I admitted. "I keep thinking about what Jake said, about wanting to remember him exactly as he is now. What if I forget the little things? What if someday I can't remember the way he tilts his head when he's listening, or the sound he makes when he's really content?" "Then we'll remind each other," Sarah said simply. "That's what families do. We help each other remember the important things." November brought earlier snow than usual, and with it, a noticeable change in Winston's energy levels. He was still himself, still gentle, still affectionate, still alert to our emotional needs, but he moved more slowly, slept more deeply, and seemed to need more encouragement to engage in activities he'd previously enjoyed. His morning walks became shorter, not because we restricted them, but because Winston would stop more frequently and for longer periods. He was still interested in greeting his neighborhood friends and investigating interesting scents, but he approached these activities with a more measured pace. Emma noticed the change immediately when she came home for Thanksgiving. "He seems older," she said, after watching Winston navigate the stairs more carefully than he had just a month earlier. "Dr. Chen says it's normal," I told her. "Dogs with heart conditions often experience periods where they need to conserve their energy more." But privately, I was beginning to understand that we were entering a new phase of Winston's life, one that would require us to follow his lead even more carefully, to let him determine what he was capable of each day, rather than maintaining expectations based on what he'd been able to do in the past. Thanksgiving that year was particularly special, because we all seemed to understand, without explicitly discussing it, that family time had taken on a heightened significance. Bob and Linda came from Phoenix, and my brother David brought his family from California, just as they had the year before. But this time, everyone's attention seemed to naturally center around Winston in a way that hadn't happened previously. The grandchildren, who were now teenagers themselves, spent hours sitting on the floor with Winston, talking to him and gently petting him, as if they understood that he was more fragile than he appeared. Bob, whose own recovery from his heart attack had given him a special bond with Winston, seemed particularly attuned to Winston's needs, making sure he always had fresh water and a comfortable place to rest. Linda, who had been won over by Winston during her previous visit, had brought him a special gift, a soft, heated bed that would help keep him comfortable during the colder months. "I thought he might appreciate a little extra warmth," she said, as we set it up in his favorite corner of the living room. Winston's reaction to the heated bed was immediate and enthusiastic. He approached it cautiously at first, then settled onto it with a sigh of contentment that made everyone in the room smile. For the rest of the weekend, he spent most of his time on his new bed, clearly appreciating the warmth and comfort it provided. "He's like an old gentleman who's finally found the perfect armchair," Emma observed, taking photos of Winston on his heated bed, completely content and dignified. That image, Winston as an elderly gentleman, comfortable and dignified, became how I started thinking about this new phase of his life. He wasn't sick or suffering. He was simply aging, and he was doing it with the same grace and wisdom he'd brought to every other challenge in his life. The weekend passed too quickly, as family gatherings always do. But this time, the goodbyes felt different. Everyone seemed to spend extra time with Winston, as if they understood that visits couldn't be taken for granted anymore. Bob knelt beside Winston's heated bed for several minutes, speaking quietly to him, just as he had after his own recovery the year before. "Take care of yourself, old friend," Bob said, his voice thick with emotion. "You've taught me so much about living with dignity." After everyone left, our house felt quieter than usual. Emma would be returning to Northwestern in a few days, and Jake was deep in the stress of college applications and final projects. Sarah and I found ourselves spending more time just sitting with Winston, not necessarily talking, but simply being present with him. One evening, as we were all gathered in the living room, Emma reading for her classes, Jake editing photos on his laptop, Sarah working on her clients' year-end accounts, I looked around and realized that this might be one of the last times we would all be together like this, with Winston as the peaceful center of our family activity. "Can I say something?" I asked, setting aside the architectural journal I'd been reading. Everyone looked up, and I found myself struggling to find the right words. "I just want you all to know how grateful I am for everything Winston has taught us. About love, about acceptance, about seeing beauty in unexpected places, about being present for each other, no matter what challenges we're facing." Emma closed her textbook and moved to sit on the floor beside Winston's heated bed. "He's still teaching us," she said, gently stroking his ears. "Right now, he's teaching us about aging gracefully, about accepting help when we need it, about finding comfort in the love of family." Jake looked up from his laptop. "I think he's also teaching us about appreciating what we have while we have it, about not taking anything for granted." Sarah reached over and took my hand. "He's teaching us about unconditional love in both directions, how to give it and how to receive it." We spent the rest of that evening simply being together, talking softly, and occasionally laughing at Winston's contented snores from his heated bed. It was one of those perfect family moments that you want to preserve forever, made even more precious by the understanding that such moments are finite and irreplaceable. When Emma left for Northwestern after Thanksgiving, her goodbye with Winston was longer and more tender than usual. She knelt beside his bed and spoke to him quietly for several minutes, her words lost in his fur, but her love clearly communicated. "Take care of everyone," she whispered, just as she always did, "and let them take care of you too." As winter settled over Colorado and we adjusted once again to our reduced family size, Winston continued to show us daily examples of how to age with dignity. He accepted help when he needed it, allowing us to assist him up the stairs on particularly difficult days, gratefully accepting extra bedding when he seemed cold, patiently tolerating additional vet visits when we were concerned about changes in his condition. But he also maintained his independence in the areas where he felt capable, still insisting on his morning patrol of the backyard, still greeting visitors with enthusiasm, still positioning himself as our family's gentle guardian and emotional anchor. Watching Winston navigate this phase of his life was teaching us profound lessons about acceptance, about the difference between giving up and adapting, about finding strength in vulnerability. He was showing us that aging doesn't have to mean becoming less valuable or less loved. It can mean becoming more precious, more appreciated, more treasured for the wisdom and perspective that only comes with time. As December arrived and we began planning for the holidays, I found myself thinking often about the gift Winston had been to our family. Not just the obvious gifts of companionship and love, but the deeper gifts of transformation, education, and spiritual growth. He had changed us all in fundamental ways, making us more compassionate, more patient, more appreciative of life's simple pleasures. But perhaps his greatest gift was still ahead of us, wrapped in the quiet dignity with which he was approaching his golden years, waiting to teach us one final lesson about what it means to live fully and love completely, right up until the very end. As winter deepened and our family prepared for what we couldn't yet know would be our last Christmas with Winston, he was about to give us the most profound gift of all, a masterclass in how to face the future with grace, courage, and unshakable love. Christmas morning 2025 dawned clear and cold in Denver with the kind of crystalline snow that makes everything look like a postcard. Winston woke up slowly on his heated bed, took his time stretching each leg, and then looked around our living room with what I can only describe as satisfaction. The Christmas tree stood in its traditional corner, wrapped presents scattered beneath it, and the whole house smelled of Sarah's cinnamon rolls baking in the oven. Emma had arrived home 2 days earlier, and the joy in Winston's eyes when he saw her was profound and heartbreaking at the same time. He'd greeted her with his usual dignity, but there was something more deliberate about his attention to her, as if he was consciously savoring every moment of her presence. Jake had documented Winston's Christmas morning routine with his camera, capturing the gentle way Winston approached each family member for his morning greetings, the careful attention he paid to the new smells and sounds of Christmas morning, the contented expression on his face as he settled on his heated bed to watch us open presents. "Look at him," Emma said softly, following my gaze to where Winston was lying. "He looks like he's cataloging everything, making sure he doesn't miss any detail." She was right. Winston seemed more present than ever, more focused on each moment, each interaction, each sensation. When Jake opened a new camera lens and the packaging made a crinkling sound, Winston's ears perked up with interest. When Sarah laughed at something silly I'd said, Winston's tail thumped gently against his bed. When Emma settled on the floor near him to open her presents, he shifted position so that he could rest one paw on her leg. Among the gifts that year was a custom photo album that Jake had created, filled with pictures of Winston throughout his time with our family. The progression was remarkable. From the hesitant, careful dog we'd brought home from the shelter to the confident, beloved family member he'd become. The final section showed Winston in his current phase, grayer around the muzzle, moving more slowly, but radiating a kind of peaceful wisdom that took my breath away. "This is incredible, Jake," Sarah said, turning the pages slowly. "It's like Winston's autobiography." "I wanted to make sure we had a record of his whole journey with us," Jake explained. From scared shelter dog to family patriarch. Winston seemed to sense that the photo album was about him. He lifted his head from his bed and looked at each of us in turn, his tail wagging slowly but steadily, as if he was acknowledging his starring role in our family's story. That afternoon, as we settled into our traditional Christmas routine of movie watching and leftover eating, I noticed that Winston was having one of his better days. His breathing seemed easier, his movements less labored, and his interest in family activities was higher than it had been in weeks. It was as if he'd summoned extra energy for this special day, determined to be fully present for what we all somehow understood might be our last Christmas together. "He looks good today," Emma observed, echoing my thoughts. "Really good." The winter months that followed were a study in cherishing ordinary moments. Winston's condition remained stable according to Dr. Chen's examinations, but we could all see that he was gradually slowing down. His afternoon naps grew longer, his morning walks became shorter, and he began choosing his activities more carefully, as if he was rationing his energy for the things that mattered most to him. What mattered most, it became clear, was simply being with his family. Winston would position himself wherever the most people were gathered, content to lie quietly and observe our daily activities. When Emma was home for winter break, he rarely left her side, as if he was making the most of her temporary presence. When she returned to Northwestern in January, he adjusted with his typical grace, but I noticed that he spent more time looking out the front window, as if he was watching for her return. Jake's senior year was reaching its climax with college acceptances and preparations for graduation. Winston seemed to understand the significance of this transition, offering extra comfort during stressful moments and celebrating quietly during happy ones. When Jake received his acceptance letter to the Colorado School of Art, where he would study photography, Winston was right there to share in the joy, his tail wagging with what seemed like genuine pride in his boy's accomplishment. "At least I'll be staying in Colorado," Jake said, kneeling beside Winston's bed after the celebration dinner. "I can visit all the time. I won't miss anything important." That phrase, "I won't miss anything important," seemed to capture something we were all feeling but hadn't articulated. There was a sense that we were in a precious time, a period that required our full attention and presence. Winston had taught us to value ordinary moments, and now those lessons felt more urgent than ever. Spring arrived early again, and with it came a brief resurgence in Winston's energy and enthusiasm. He seemed to enjoy the warmer weather, spending more time in the backyard and showing renewed interest in his favorite activities. We began to hope that his good phase might continue indefinitely, that with careful management and lots of love, Winston might have many more months or even years with us. But on a Tuesday morning in early April, everything changed. I was getting ready for work when I heard an unusual sound from downstairs. Not quite a bark, not quite a whine, but something that immediately made my heart race with worry. Racing down the stairs, I found Winston lying on his side in the living room, breathing rapidly and shallowly, his eyes wide with what looked like confusion and fear. "Sarah," I called, dropping to my knees beside Winston. "Something's wrong." Sarah appeared in her robe, took one look at Winston, and immediately grabbed her car keys. "We need to get him to the clinic, now." The drive to the emergency veterinary clinic felt like the longest 30 minutes of my life. Winston lay across my lap in the back seat, his breathing labored but his eyes fixed on my face with absolute trust. I found myself talking to him constantly, telling him he was going to be okay, that we loved him, that we would take care of him. "Hang on, buddy," I whispered into his ear. "Just hang on." Dr. Martinez, the same emergency vet who had treated Winston's initial heart episode, met us at the entrance with a gurney and immediately took Winston into the treatment area. Sarah and I waited in the familiar room that smelled of antiseptic and anxiety, holding hands and trying not to imagine the worst. When Dr. Martinez returned an hour later, her expression was gentle but serious. "Winston is stable for now," she said, settling into the chair across from us. "But his heart condition has progressed significantly. He's experiencing congestive heart failure, which means his heart isn't pumping efficiently enough to meet his body's needs." She explained that while they could manage his symptoms with stronger medications and additional treatments, Winston's condition was now considered terminal. With aggressive care, he might have weeks or possibly a few months, but his quality of life would likely decline progressively. "The question," Dr. Martinez said gently, "is what kind of life Winston would want to live, and what you, as his family, feel is best for him." We brought Winston home that afternoon with a complex array of new medications and detailed instructions for his care. He seemed more comfortable than he had that morning, but I could see in his eyes that something fundamental had changed. The confusion and fear from the morning had been replaced by a kind of quiet acceptance, as if he understood that this was the beginning of a new and final chapter. Jake took the day off from school to be home when we returned, and his reunion with Winston was tender and heartbreaking. Winston lifted his head from his heated bed and managed a weak tail wag, but the effort seemed to exhaust him. "Hey, old man," Jake said softly, sitting beside Winston's bed. "Gave us quite a scare this morning." We called Emma at Northwestern, and her response was immediate and decisive. "I'm coming home," she said. "I'm driving tonight. I'll be there tomorrow morning." "Emma, you don't need to—" "Yes, I do. If this is serious, I need to be there. Northwestern will understand." That evening, as we adjusted to Winston's new medication schedule and tried to process the reality of his diagnosis, our house felt different. Not sad exactly, but heightened somehow, as if every moment had taken on additional significance. Winston seemed to sense the change in atmosphere. Despite his obvious fatigue, he made an effort to visit each family member, offering gentle comfort even while he was clearly the one who needed comforting. When Sarah cried quietly while preparing his evening medications, Winston somehow found the strength to approach her and rest his head on her leg. When Jake sat staring at his college acceptance letters with tears in his eyes, Winston positioned himself beside Jake's chair and offered his presence as comfort. Emma arrived the next morning looking exhausted from her all-night drive, but determined to make the most of whatever time we had left with Winston. Her reunion with him was devastating and beautiful. She knelt beside his bed and held him gently while both of them seemed to communicate volumes without words. "I'm here," she whispered into his fur. "I'm not going anywhere." The next few weeks were unlike anything our family had ever experienced. We knew we were living in borrowed time, but instead of making every moment feel desperate, this knowledge somehow made everything more precious, more intentional, more filled with love. Winston's daily routine became the center around which everything else revolved. His medications had to be given precisely on schedule, his comfort monitored constantly, his needs anticipated before he had to ask for help. But rather than feeling burdensome, caring for Winston felt like the most important work any of us had ever done. Dr. Chen visited our house twice during those weeks, something she rarely did for patients, but she'd developed a special fondness for Winston over the years. During her second visit, she helped us understand what we should watch for as his condition progressed, and she assured us that we would know when it was time to make the final decision. "Winston will tell you," she said gently. "Dogs are remarkably clear about when they're ready to let go. Until then, just love him and let him love you." And that's exactly what we did. We loved Winston with every ounce of our beings, and we let him continue to love us in all the ways he knew how. Despite his physical limitations, Winston remained emotionally present for our family in remarkable ways. When Emma struggled with the decision of whether to return to Northwestern for her final exams, Winston seemed to sense her conflict and offered comfort through his steady presence. When Jake worried about leaving for college in the fall, Winston managed to convey, somehow, that it was okay to move forward with life even in the face of loss. The end came on a sunny Thursday morning in early May. Winston had seemed particularly peaceful the night before, settling onto his heated bed with a deep sigh of contentment after his evening medications. When I woke up at dawn to check on him, I found him lying in the same position, but something in his breathing told me that this was the day we'd been preparing for. I woke Sarah, Jake, and Emma, and we all gathered around Winston's bed. He was conscious and alert, but his breathing was shallow and labored. When he saw all of us there, his tail managed one last gentle wag, and his eyes moved from face to face as if he was saying goodbye to each of us individually. Dr. Chen arrived within an hour of our call, bringing with her the quiet dignity and compassion that had marked all of Winston's medical care. She explained the process gently, assuring us that Winston would simply fall asleep peacefully, without pain or fear. "Would you like a few more minutes with him?" she asked. We each took turns saying goodbye to Winston, telling him how much he'd meant to us, how much he'd taught us, how grateful we were for every day he'd spent as part of our family. Emma went last, lying down beside Winston's bed and holding him close while she whispered words that were meant for his ears alone. When Dr. Chen administered the medication, Winston simply closed his eyes and let out one final, peaceful breath. The absence of his breathing was immediate and absolute, but somehow the room still felt full of love, full of gratitude, full of the immeasurable gift he'd given to all of us. We buried Winston in our backyard under the oak tree, where he'd spent so many happy hours watching squirrels and enjoying the changing seasons. Jake designed a simple stone marker that read, Winston. Beloved family member, teacher, and friend. He taught us that beauty comes from within. The grief was enormous, but so was the gratitude. Winston had given us 4.5 years of unconditional love, daily lessons in resilience and acceptance, and countless examples of how to live with grace and dignity regardless of circumstances. He'd shown us that a dog dismissed as ugly by others could become the most beautiful member of our family through the power of love and acceptance. Emma returned to Northwestern to finish her semester, but she called every day to check on how we were handling Winston's absence. Jake threw himself into his final photography projects, creating a memorial series about Winston that earned him recognition at the state level. Sarah and I found comfort in talking about Winston's impact on our family, sharing favorite memories and marveling at how profoundly one dog had changed our lives. 3 months after Winston's death, we received a call from Maria at the Rocky Mountain Animal Shelter. A family had specifically requested to adopt a dog like Winston, an older bulldog with health issues who had been overlooked by other potential adopters because of his appearance. "Would you be willing to meet with them?" Maria asked. They read the article about Winston and said they want to give another dog the same kind of love you gave him. The family, the Garcias, came to our house on a Saturday afternoon. They brought their 2 teenage children and listened intently as we told them about Winston's journey from rejected shelter dog to beloved family member. When we showed them Jake's photo albums and told them about the lessons Winston had taught us, Mrs. Garcia began to cry. "We want to love a dog the way you loved Winston," she said. "We want to learn what he taught you about seeing beauty in unexpected places." A week later, the Garcias adopted Buster, a 6-year-old English bulldog with hip problems and a pronounced underbite who had been at the shelter for 8 months without any adoption interest. Maria sent us a photo from the adoption day. Buster sitting between the Garcia children, his tail wagging, his face radiating the same dignified happiness that Winston had shown when he realized he'd found his forever family. That photo sits on our mantel now, next to Jake's favorite portrait of Winston. Looking at it reminds me that Winston's legacy continues, that the lessons he taught us about love, acceptance, and seeing beauty beyond conventional standards are being passed on to new families and new dogs. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light falls across our living room floor in just the right way, I can almost see Winston there on his heated bed, watching over our family with the same gentle wisdom he showed throughout his life. I imagine him satisfied with the love he gave and received, proud of the lessons he taught, and content knowing that his story continues to inspire others to look beyond the surface and see the beautiful souls that wait to be discovered. Winston came to us as the dog nobody wanted, dismissed and rejected because he didn't fit conventional standards of canine beauty. He left us as the most beloved member of our family, having taught us that real beauty comes from love, loyalty, kindness, and the courage to be authentically yourself, regardless of what others think. He sleeps now in our backyard under the oak tree, but his influence continues to shape our family every day. Emma calls him her inspiration for choosing to work with children who have special needs. Jake's photography consistently focuses on finding beauty in unexpected subjects. Sarah and I have learned to see each other and our children with the same unconditional acceptance that Winston showed all of us. Most importantly, Winston taught us that love doesn't see with the eyes, but with the heart, and that the most beautiful souls often come in the most unexpected packages. He showed us that everyone, every dog, every person, every living being, deserves a chance to be loved for who they truly are rather than how they appear on the surface. In the end, Winston's greatest gift wasn't just the love he gave us, but the way he transformed our capacity to love others. He made us better people, better family members, and better citizens of a world that too often judges by appearances rather than character. The bulldog who was once called ugly had become the most beautiful creature any of us had ever known, and his beauty lives on in every life he touched, every lesson he taught, and every heart he opened to the transformative power of unconditional love. Winston's story is over, but his legacy continues every time someone chooses to look beyond the surface, every time someone gives a chance to the overlooked.